Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, we can.
great. And we are recording the presentation so that we can post just the presentation portion of this up on the website. So thanks. All right. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So on behalf of the Governance Task Force, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's presentation and conversation. We have everybody on the task force here, myself, Karen Ermler, Peggy Shao, Sally Iracane, Todd Landis, John Thompson is with us, Katrina will be joining us. Don Hill has also been part of a number of our conversations. I don't believe that he's here tonight, but it's been part of the conversation. Oops, let's go back. So it's been a while since our special congregational meeting in April, at which we as a congregation approved and affirmed the vision, which you see up on the screen, and 7 key commitments. To date, our work as a task force has focused on commitment 5, to adopt a more nimble and sustainable congregational governance model that allows members to devote their energy to mission and spiritual growth. So what have we done so far? Well, we've reviewed your comments from the what and why conversations. We've considered recent nominating committee experiences and feedback from team chairs and members. We've familiarized ourselves with Union's current governance structure, as well as models that Union adopted in the past. We've explored what our denomination, the United Church of Christ, has to say about governance and the practice of leadership. We've familiarized ourselves with several current sources on best practices in church governance. We've looked at trends in volunteerism. We've interviewed 8 communities of faith about their governance structures and the impact of structure on mission, staffing, volunteerism, congregational energy, and the implementation of new ideas. We've reflected on our own experiences, and we have processed all this information individually and collectively as a group to identify some patterns, some lessons, and some evolving learnings that we want to share with you today. And the key word in that last sentence was evolving. So our primary goal tonight is to share with you the work we've done to date and our evolving, as I said, learning and thinking. We don't have all the answers. We're also going to share with you some of the questions that we intend to explore further over the next couple of months. Tonight is an opportunity to establish some common vocabulary and a common understanding of our own history and the context for our work. So this is an update, not a recommendation, and we really are anxious and looking forward to hearing your comments and questions, which will, of course, inform our future work. A couple of words about our plans for tonight's session. We plan on spending about an hour and 15 minutes together. The goal is to create a framework together for our work and our thinking as a congregation. We have a lot of information to present today, and we do want to allow time at the end for discussion. So procedurally, we're going to ask you to hold questions, to hold and not comment in the chat so that we can all really focus in on the presentation, and then we'll open the floor when we get to that point. If you saw the email that went out today, we do have some discussion questions at the end. If you have a piece of paper and pencil or the back of an envelope or something like that, I suggest you grab it now. And John is going to put the discussion questions in the chat. And as you listen, feel free to jot down notes about what, if you hear something that confuses you or intrigues you, or something you'd like more clarity about, jot it down, because in holding questions, we don't want you to lose those questions. We really want to get those questions and comments. Another word about the presentation. Some of the slides have a lot of information, and we will be highlighting key features depending on the size of your screen. Hopefully you can read everything in the slides, but if you can't, don't worry, we will make the slides available on the website later this week. So lastly, when we started this work and we're talking with folks and churches that had undergone any governance change, we were reminded that governance work can be messy and it can be time consuming. And we were urged to treat each other with gentleness. And in that spirit, I would like to begin this time together with a prayer. So please pray with me. Loving God, help us feel your presence in our midst as we discern our way forward together as a congregation seeking to do your will in this time and place. God, we come from a place of love. We all come with love for you, for this community of faith, for each other. Help us to listen and learn, to question and reflect, to hear your voice in our conversation. Help us to be curious as to where this journey together will take us, and filled with wonder with all that is possible through you. In your name we pray. Amen.
So part of our journey together has been to write down some thoughts, questions, try to condense some of the things we have been learning. This is a reflection that I wrote along the way. Our task force's readings and discussions have taught me a lot. Prior to joining the task force, I was unthinking and undisturbed about our governance structure and procedure. I have learned that there could be more efficient, accountable, productive ways of carrying out the church's mission and ministries. We need more clarity about accountability, about the relationships between clergy, the executive director, staff, lay leaders, and the congregation, about the composition and role of the leadership council, and ways to cultivate fresh vision and to implement the various ministries of the church. Now, I'm also beginning to think about how we are going to engage the rest of the congregation, that's you, in this journey. From our research and interviews, we learned of different models for governance structure, raised questions about where authority is vested and who is accountable to whom, how a congregation is empowered to do ministry, and who sets the vision for carrying out the mission of the church. The roles and responsibilities of different components of the church have become clearer as task force members each tried to put their understanding in writing. What does the UCC say about governance? What parameters, if any, does our denomination place on our structure and our practice? Two key concepts here from the United Church of Christ. The basic unit of organization is the UCC, in the UCC is the local church, not the presbytery, not the diocese. Each church can adopt its own governance structure and methods. We covenant together to be in community, seeking to discern God's purpose for us and to do God's will. The church's capacity to compromise and adapt has been essential to its survival. We are called to form and reform the church. Union has made major changes to its governance structure a number of times throughout its history, often to make us a more inclusive community. The last major overhaul of the entire structure was in April 1974, almost 50 years ago. The world has changed a lot since then. What distinguishes churches from nonprofits is the role of the divine. Our denomination has used "God is still speaking" as its motto, reminding us that there will always be new ways that God speaks to us, shows up, and calls us. It helps remind us that we are accountable not just to our former members and traditions and to our current members, but also to the future and to our mission. How do we organize ourselves in a way that will work in an ever-changing world? The structure of the past or present may not be the way in the future. How does our governance structure reflect our desire to listen for where God is still speaking and let that shape the work we do together? How do we make space for the inspiration of the Spirit, moving our members to share their time and talent in new ways? How do we create space for the divine to intervene? Who are the players in any church governance model? Typically, churches assign responsibilities and varying degrees of authority and accountability to the congregation, the governing board, known at Union at this point in time as the Leadership Council, the clergy, the executive director, and other staff, current leadership teams, worship, deacons, stewardship, welcoming, and more, current committees, finance, pastoral relations, and more, task forces, small groups, ministry teams, standing committees. And don't worry if you can't distinguish between some of these or define the roles and responsibilities of these various entities. We are working today towards a shared definition and understanding of some of these entities and considering appropriate roles, responsibilities, and accountability for these players so that together we effectively, efficiently, and faithfully further our mission as a Christian community. Now, let's pause for a moment. Just take a minute or two to draw a sketch on a paper, if you have it there, of Union's current governance model. This is not a test. Just jot down what you understand it to be. Use boxes, lines, words, whatever works for you to create a framework, and don't overthink it. I hope you have a piece of paper and a pencil nearby, and we will not ask you to share individually, but perhaps to show your paper on the screen if you'd like at the end of this exercise. So start thinking, but don't overthink.
I'll put the timer on for a minute. Okay.
Okay, we only gave you a minute, but we're just wondering how you did. Can you, if you have, can you show us put your paper up in front of the camera and show us how you've done and what thoughts you had already? Can you do that now, please?
All right.
Okay, thank you. How did you do? This is,
Hold on.
whoops.
I'll catch up to you there.
Okay, now we have a sketch of pretty much what our church is looking like. How did you do? Was yours anything like this? Robes and Amory created this sketch for our task force, and it reveals a fairly complex structure and one that's not necessarily intuitive, even to folks who have been members and friends for a number of years. There are a lot of lines in reality, and we actually have more. A few key points about this sketch is that virtually all active members and friends are involved with committee and leadership work, or if they're not, they've contributed a lifetime of service. And a number of folks are on one or more committees. Looking just at our leadership council, our governing board structure is typical of post-World War II family and pastoral sized congregations. The board is comprised of committee chairs who, in addition to their board responsibilities, are also charged with running a program of the church. Typical, and we are no exception, such boards get larger over time due to the feeling that every important program of the church deserves board representation. Typically, virtually every aspect of church life is assigned to a committee, a team in our case. This system has a virtue of stability, but it can make it difficult for new ministries and ideas to gain traction because existing committees are already busy, and it's difficult to exist outside of the current structure. As you will hear later, it is also a system that can be draining for committee chairs. We are truly fortunate to be part of such an active and engaged congregation. This past year, we elected 83 members and friends to committee, team, and leadership positions. We appointed over 30 more to various task force and standing committees. Quite a number of folks are doing double and triple duty on committees and task forces. As a point of reference, our average worship attendance over the past couple years is about 110. That means online and in person. And we have used that as a proxy for active members for purposes of this conversation. So as we have noted, it's all hands on deck in terms of committee work. A very rough calculation indicates that we are spending upwards of 2,000 hours collectively in committee meetings annually. That's a lot of hours. Of course, there will also always be some meetings, but 2,000 plus hours doesn't count the active hours spent actually engaging in ministry and living out our call to follow and practice the teachings of Jesus. So what have we learned so far? We know that the world has changed dramatically over the past 50 years. In our own community conversations, in our readings, and the message is clear. Demands on working families have dramatically changed the nature of volunteerism. As we saw before, our current structure is committee-focused, labor-intensive, and confusing. Demands on leadership council members can be intense. Folks joining church today want fewer committee meetings, less bureaucracy, and more opportunities to engage in service, to promote justice, and to engage in meaningful spiritual experiences. One of the sources we consulted was this book by Carrie Corton and Blake Bradford. Consistent with our findings in our structure, Cotan and Bradford assert that the mainland church's congregational governance structure was designed with multiple layers of checks and balances. Our inherited governance and leadership structure is a system built to maintain and preserve the ecclesiastical institution, to make sure that nothing too crazy or reactive happens. While this may have been fine in the America post-war era of the church growth and engagement, the missional church of the 21st century must be creatively and structurally enabled to make changes in methods to fulfill its mission. We know that rapid cultural change is not going away. And as the authors of the Insight article on simple governance point out, the typical church structure is driving the mission rather than the mission driving the structure. Another leader in the field of church governance, Dan Hotchkiss, puts it this way: a congregation that invites people to participate in organized life appeals to only a few, but a congregation that invites people directly into spiritual growth and service appeals to many. Outdated, overly complex, and inwardly focused structures might be one cause of decline in congregations. Volunteers require that the nature and scope of the work be defined honestly and clearly, and the benefits be significant and tangible, and that the work itself makes good use of the talents of the volunteer. As one UCC minister put it, volunteers have time, but they don't have time to waste. Efficiency is one of the reasons that churches are choosing to change their governance structure. And now I'll hand it off to Sally to talk more about governing boards.
So over the course of the summer, we interviewed 8 communities of faith, and you can see them listed on the screen here. We interviewed congregations smaller, larger, and roughly comparable in size to Union. We asked about the size and responsibilities of their governing board. We asked if they had made recent changes to their governance structure. We interviewed a number of faith communities with executive directors. We asked about clergy roles and responsibilities, as well as the role and responsibility of the executive director. We asked about the role of the congregation. And here are some themes that emerged from those conversations. So with 2 exceptions, congregations are moving away from boards comprised primarily of committee chairs, officers with a few at-large members, to boards comprised primarily of at-large members with perhaps a few committee chairs. A clear trend is boards that handle oversight relating to policies, finance, property, investments, building, personnel. Standing committees for these areas report to the board. All UCC and Unitarian churches that we interviewed have smaller governing boards than unions. In addition, several congregations increased their reliance on their executive committee during the pandemic and haven't returned to using larger boards. Synagogue governing boards are larger, but even 2 of the 3 that we spoke with have reduced the size of their board in recent years. New initiatives are typically vetted by clergy, with major initiatives approved by the governing board and also often by the congregation. In the chart on the right, we can see that the size of our governing board, with 18 members, is an outlier in terms of active members per board member. In other words, we are using more volunteers per capita, so to speak, than any of the churches we interviewed. Our readings support what we heard from our interviews about the movement towards smaller governing boards. Dan Hotchkiss favors a 7-member board and says it's rare to find a board of more than 9 members that can work together effectively as a team. Interestingly, he also favors a smaller board because he believes that it actually creates incentives for the board to communicate more effectively with the congregation and to solicit input from the congregation more frequently. A smaller board, he points out, can't operate under the assumption or illusion that they fully represent the congregation, and they need to take steps to solicit that feedback more frequently. Similarly, Cotan and Bradford recommend a 9-person board with non-renewable 3-year terms. In a non-church-centric world, they say, church structures should be lean, effective, and efficient, removing bureaucracy, positions, and layers of decision-making allows more members to spend time in service. Pulling some of our evolving thinking together, the evidence we've gathered supports the notions of a smaller governing board to facilitate more meaningful discussions on key strategic issues, and freeing up volunteer time. Is size of the governing board all that's important? No. Some of you wondered during the community conversations how fewer people could get the job done. It's equally important to shift our thinking in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the governing board from management to oversight. Congregations who had shifted their governance structures and authors writing about governance focus more on oversight or policy governance. In general, they describe the duties of a governing board to be focused on oversight, articulating mission, choosing major goals and strategies with input from the congregation, clergy, and executive director, delegating authority to those who lead the daily work and holding them accountable, safeguarding the congregation's money, property, and people, creating permission-giving policies and procedures, and seeking input from the congregation on key issues through quarterly town hall meetings, surveys, and regular one-on-one conversations. There could be standing and ad hoc committees that advise the board on key fiduciary responsibilities such as finance, investments, HR, etc. We have spent a lot of time discussing the composition of the board and are inclining towards a board made up of what we would consider at-large members, so that team chairs can focus on execution and ministry. This would situate all board members as representatives of the entire congregation and really underscore the need for the board to solicit that input and initiate more two-way conversations with the congregation. In our conversations about the size of the governing board, our focus has been on making the congregation's decision-making power more responsive and unleashing lay leadership for ministry. It's not about consolidating power. It's about creating clarity in roles, connecting responsibility and authority, and bringing missional focus to the congregation and its leadership. So next we'll spend a little bit of time talking about ministry teams. Ministry teams are more than a name change. It's a conceptual shift. From our interviews, we learned that most of the communities of faith have migrated already or are migrating to a more explicit structure of ministries instead of standing teams or committees that have an elected slate of members and monthly meetings. Clergy and staff who are already on the ground, so to speak, in terms of execution, facilitate the ministry teams and often provide continuity as volunteers term in and out. There was a sense of urgency to this evolution and a recognition of the motivation of the church volunteers. As one pastor put it, people want to join a movement, not a bureaucracy. When we as a task force talk about ministry teams, we are talking about the power of the church, empowered to do the work of the church. One author likens it to a bicycle, where the ministry teams are the pedals. You can't get anywhere without the power of the pedals. Clergy and staff are in frequent conversations with ministry teams. Ministry team members are not just doers completing an assignment. They can also be involved in the creation of operational plans to achieve ministry goals aligned with the mission and vision of the church. So how are ministry teams different than the teams we have now? Are ministry teams the same as small groups? What would it look like for us as members and friends of Union? We are still talking about these issues as a task force and have some evolving learnings, if not conclusions or recommendations at this point. It's not just a name change. We would need to look at the responsibilities of our current existing teams: worship, outreach, welcoming, congregational life, and more. A current team might become multiple ministry teams. We might combine functions in different ways. Some responsibilities might shift to the board or to staff. How might this appear for these two active members of Union we see on the screen? They might be involved in a wide variety of ministry teams and small groups. They would still be serving the church with their gifts and talents. but fewer meetings and more focused volunteer opportunities would make better use of their time. Additionally, new ministries could emerge organically without having to be fit into or added on top of the workload of our existing committee structure. And now I'll hand it off for more discussion around role clarity.
I'm going to talk about the clarity of roles between the congregation, the clergy, the executive director, and the staff. So let's start with the congregation. Where does our authority come from? As we know, the local church is the basic unit of the UCC. In Union's current governance model, we as a congregation actively exercise our authority as governors by approving our annual budget and electing the members of our governing board. Through our constitution and bylaws, we determine the responsibilities and authority we delegate to our officers, leadership council, clergy, and teams. We call and dismiss our spiritual leaders. That congregational authority is foundational to our identity and theology and would remain. As a task force, we've discussed the possibility of adding to that authority by asking the congregation to approve missional priorities on an annual basis. We are also envisioning a specific, explicit planning role for the congregation. We are envisioning, as we have said, regular, frequent, two-way conversations with the board and with the staff about missional priorities and vision for the future, where our input is actively solicited. This could take the form of additional congregational meetings, town hall meetings, surveys, and/or small group meetings. And we are ministers in our church community and in the world, demonstrating our love for God and our neighbor through our service on ministry teams. So what does our evolving thinking say about the role of the clergy? As they do today, our clergy would serve as our spiritual leader, providing worship and spiritual opportunities, as well as pastoral care. Our clergy would lead the congregation in ministry to the wider community. Our pastors would work together with the executive director and staff to carry out the daily operations of the church. They would oversee and provide guidance to the ministries of the church, and they would lead the congregation through regular visioning and discernment to set priorities and annual ministry goals. It became clear through our interviews with our own members and staff that greater clarity is needed in terms of the role of our clergy and executive director in relationship to our governance structure. We need to better align authority and responsibility so that the people we are asking to do the work have the authority to do that work. With the new role of executive director, we are in good company with other churches and synagogues with a similar role. In the faith communities we interviewed, those executive directors collaborate with clergy and lay leadership in choosing major goals, strategic planning, and ensuring continuity. The EDs also have oversight of a number of key areas of operations that include budget preparation and management, member engagement, communications, building and facilities management, HR, staff hiring and supervision, excluding the clergy, and would also have an active role in fundraising. For us, the creation of the executive director position has been critical in modernizing our operations. Church leadership recognized that the senior minister did not have the training or experience in finance, HR, and other areas that bring someone in with that experience would allow our clergy to focus on their ministry. It was no longer realistic to continue to expect volunteers to spend as many hours as some were doing on finance, personnel, buildings and grounds, and other areas. We need to professionalize our system. The executive director understands the mission of the church, partners with the clergy to lead the staff, and works closely with the clergy and officers in our current structure to bring the church's mission to life. Going forward, we need to make sure that this role is reflected in our governance structure and its responsibility is aligned with its authority.
Thanks, Todd. So as we said at the outset, we are still very much in conversation as a task force, asking questions of ourselves. I'm sure you have some questions about what you've heard. We want to engage you in that process so that we can all learn together as we go through this. Here are some of the questions that we anticipate exploring in more detail in the weeks ahead. We don't have answers to all these questions tonight. What is the optimal size of the board? We think smaller, but how much smaller? How many? Should we have specialists on the board in areas like finance, HR, building? And or do we have standing committees and task forces responsible for specific areas and issues? Should specific committees have board representation? How would all the current team responsibilities be covered? What ministry teams and standing committees might we need? Do our staff and clergy have the capacity to oversee and engage with the ministry teams? What is the accountability structure for clergy, staff, board, committees, and ministry teams? What would be the timing for prospective changes to the governance structure? Would it affect the nominating cycle this year? And in terms of timing, I just want to assure everybody who is here tonight that we are proceeding very methodically. Our next steps include getting your feedback from what you've heard today, reviewing options with the Leadership Council, developing more specific recommendations, and that would include a timeline. But I don't want anyone to worry or lose sleep. We're not looking at a flash cut at the annual meeting in February to some brand new and untested structure. So we've presented a lot of information, a lot of food for thought, I hope. We hope that you have a much better sense of our current thinking and possible directions for the future. So what are a few key elements that we hope you will remember from tonight's presentation? First, in a model of shared leadership, as is the case with the UCC, clarity around roles, responsibilities, and accountability is key to successful governance. The world has changed, families have changed, technology has changed dramatically, and not just in the past 2 years with COVID, but over the last 50 years. Our values and our calling to be followers of Jesus stay the same, but we are called to form and reform our practices. God is still speaking to us, calling us into the future. Change is already happening at Union, reflecting the need to review some of our practices. Ministry teams are already sprouting, so to speak, independent of committee work. Groups like Climate Justice, the Green Sprouts, the Circles program. Communication and feedback opportunities are also increasing. We've had more frequent congregational conversations in the past year and anticipate more into the future. With support from John and our staff, our clergy and our lay leaders are more able to focus on mission planning and ministry. And just a couple more. We have the opportunity to channel our congregation's energy into ministries that are more fulfilling and connected to our spirituality. A smaller governing board and ministry teams which reflect a new approach to committee work would enable us to have deeper and more impactful meetings that give greater focus and clarity with respect to the mission of the church. If there's a tagline here, it's basically more ministry, spirituality, and mission, and less bureaucracy. And most importantly, we really need your input and feedback. We intentionally scheduled this update during the task force's exploration phase to share some of our thinking and to take your pulse.